We're good. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church, Tullahoma. Welcome to those of you at church, those of you on Zoom, and those of you on live stream. For today's opening reading, I'd like to read a quote from the inspirational Don Williams. Well, I don't believe that heaven waits for only those who congregate. I like to think of God as love. He's down below. He's up above. He's watching people everywhere. He knows who does and doesn't care. And I'm an ordinary man. Sometimes I wonder who I am. But I believe in love. I believe in music. I believe in magic. And I believe in you. Okay, for our chalice lighting, Costa, would you mind lighting the chalice? Where we find the darkness of ignorance, let us bring the light of reason. Where the darkness of despair prevails, may we share the light of hope. When we encounter the darkness of hate, let us shine the light of love. Thank you, Costa. Announcements, I have a few, but I'd open it up to the floor first. Anyone with announcements? Gene?
I have an announcement. I need some help. That's not an announcement, that's a request. Anyway, Kyle at the Tullahoma paper has agreed to put in a blurb for us. I think I've mentioned it before, but I need for somebody to help me create, well, I've created it. I need for somebody with WordPerfect to create it for Kyle so he can spread it to the other newspapers in the area, and he will replay it every month. His computer's going to be set up so that it'll tell we are Unitarians, this is what we believe as our guides. And if these resonate, you belong with us. Something like that. If somebody can create that for me.
I can work with you on that, Gene.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Will you be here during the board meeting?
When is it after the?
After today's?
Sure.
Okay, then we'll get that arranged today.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you very much for working
Board
on that.
meeting today.
Oh, you're
Be glad
welcome.
to help.
You're right.
Any other announcements? Jim?
Yeah, I have a couple of announcements you just made. We do have a board meeting after service, so we do board meetings on the third Sunday of the month. This will be the last board meeting for this fiscal year. And as a result of that, this will be the last board meeting that Katie attends as the Director of Religious Education. So she's been doing it for many, many years. I believe it's been 7 years. I'm not sure if Katie can clarify that. But I want to express my appreciation to Katie, and I think all of us should. So let's give Katie a round of applause. Thank you, Katie. That's it.
Okay. Any other announcements? Carrie?
Thank you, Katie. Next Sunday, she will be speaking to us on a discussion of gender and sexuality.
Looking forward to it. Any other announcements? Okay. All right. First, before I forget, it's Miss Debbie Hedges' birthday today. Sorry, I didn't mean to shock you. Hope you knew. Let's see. Also, next week is the last Sunday of the month, so please join us for potluck, and please bring a donation for a local charity if you can. And if you can't, please attend anyway. We'd love to have you there. There's always enough food. It's a good time. If you wish to donate to the work of the church, please send a check to UU Church of Tullahoma, P.O. Box 331, Tullahoma, Tennessee 37388, or drop in the shaker box at the back of the sanctuary. For today's reading, I kind of created one of my own. Bear with me. Let us bow our heads and pray. Dear Lord, Creator, Buddha, Allah, Deity, sentient being, locator of lost keys and righteous decider of all sporting events, please watch over our thoughts and our actions, our health and our prosperity as we embark on our daily journey. Give us wisdom and patience to go forth and do good in this world. May our thoughts be kind and our hands move mountains. I offer this prayer not to mock or disparage the existence of or lack thereof an omnipresent being amongst us, but rather to ask you to seek the God that is within you. Be the good, the love, and the light. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Doug Traversa, and his topic, unless you've changed the title. Nope. How did I miss that? Thank you, Doug. Thank you.
So a couple of things as a preface before I get into the sermon proper. It has been quite a month for Jancy and I. We're dealing with parents who are elderly and sick. My father's been in the hospital for 5 days at one point. He either has heart or kidney or both problems. We're going to find more out this week. We moved both sets of parents. We've gotten 2 more dogs. It has been a busy month. More chaos than we've experienced in quite some time. I also want to set a stage for what I'm going to talk about today. Those of you who don't know me, I just want to establish where I'm coming from, because we're sort of going to do a mental exercise. We're going to do a way of thinking about things that don't necessarily jive with what I believe, but are possible and rational nonetheless. So, I don't believe in God as traditionally presented, certainly in the Bible or in Christianity or Islam or Judaism. But I'm going to talk about that kind of God today. And I'm going to talk about a God that had something to do, at least, with the creation of the Bible narrative about Jesus. And I'm going to talk about Jesus as though the gospel narrative is fairly accurate. Now, I don't know any of these things, but these are things that are very important to many people. And so I'm going to be coming from that perspective today. I'm going to put myself in the shoes of one who believes these things and is wrestling with a major issue there. And so don't go out of here thinking Doug's become a Christian again or something. That's not what I'm driving at. But my final point for setup is very important. I have never had in my life what you would call a major mystical experience. I've never felt the presence of God. I've never had an enlightenment experience or an awakening experience or a zap of spiritual insight or anything like that. I don't think my brain's wired that way. But I did have something really close recently. I have, over the last few months, been listening to, meeting with groups of very liberal, progressive Christians and having discussions like we do in the Sunday school we go to before we came here. You would have loved it. Today we got quite into the nature of suffering and why God allows suffering, and my argument was, ultimately, when you see the sorts of suffering we're talking about, God either isn't there or doesn't care. And that's a Sunday school that lets you say that and get away with it. They don't kick you out for being a heretic. But I've also been listening to podcasts, and I've participated in a couple of these podcasts. And there's one called Recovering Evangelicals. It's a couple of guys who are wrestling with what does it mean to be a Christian in the 21st century, with accepting all the science, all the history, all the things we've learned. What does it mean to be a Christian? And towards the end of an episode, probably about 4 months ago, someone made a comment, because this was what they call a mailbag episode, so people would write in and they'd respond. And someone made the point that Jesus' sacrifice, his death, wasn't that big of a deal because he didn't stay dead. He was resurrected 3 days later. And the hosts, Scott and Luke, were discussing in great detail the agonies of what crucifixion actually is. This was not new to me, and I'm not going to give you the details. It's pretty gruesome. But they said this was a big deal because the death was horrific. It was a torturous, slow death. And even if he was resurrected thereafter, it was a great sacrifice. And again, understand that these two are both what you would call very liberal Christians. They don't believe Jesus was a sacrifice to pay for sins. They don't buy that. But they do think that Jesus' death was necessary for some reason, reasons they're still wrestling with. perhaps as the ultimate example of sacrificial living. Now, I was listening to this on my headphones as I'm out walking the dogs at night, as I do every day, and I still remember it quite vividly. It was cold. I walked down a hill to a cul-de-sac, come around, come back up, and I'm coming up the hill with my dogs, and they're having this discussion, and the first time in my life, and the only time still to this point, I actually felt like a metaphorical slap in the face, like an awakening moment, where something finally clicked after all these years. How did I miss that? Thus the title of the sermon. Something became clear to me that had always just sort of hovered outside the range of my perceptions. And it said, it is madness that an otherwise good, kind people, including so many people I've known, will seriously discuss why Jesus had to be tortured to death. And I said, this is the problem. This is the problem. The next day, and I'll get more into that in a minute. The next day I was watching a video on YouTube by Bart Ehrman, who's a famous Bible scholar who had left the faith and is now a non-believer. And he discusses how Jesus begged God 3 times before the crucifixion not to die. He kept saying, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, please take this burden from me. Jesus did not want to be crucified. We always focus on the fact that he says, not your will, but mine. Jesus didn't want to be crucified. Who in their right mind would want to be crucified? It's horrible. Jesus begs God 3 times to take this from him, and God does not take it from him. And as I'm watching this, the very next day, again, something broke in me. Christianity, the form I practiced anyway, is at its most fundamental level deeply, fatally flawed, because at its most basic level it requires, even desires, the torturous death of an innocent man. Now, whether it's as a blood sacrifice to appease an angry God, or an example of the ultimate self-sacrifice, as the liberals proclaim, the ultimate in sacrificial living, most, if not all, versions of Christianity, progressive or conservative, have at their center a God who wanted Jesus to die, to be tortured to death. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, you could, for instance, go into any Catholic church and you will see a crucifix. Not a cross, but an actual crucifix with Jesus still hanging on the cross. Sometimes you'll see something called the Sacred Heart, which is a painting of a heart. Sometimes it's the Valentine type heart, but sometimes it's a realistic looking heart. And then it's got thorns all around it, and sometimes blood dripping out of it. And if we hadn't experienced this from our youth and seen it over and over and over again and saw it for the first time, you would be shocked at the emphasis on these horrible things. It's not just the Catholic Church either. Christian churches throughout will have a cross hanging up. They made that the symbol of their religion. The cross is an instrument of torture and death. And yes, it's supposed to symbolize what Jesus did, but still kind of jarring. And there were certainly other symbols that could have been used. Humans have created in their minds this idealized victim, Jesus. And now they make relics of his death and hang it in their worship areas. This is the symbol of a very powerful and influential religion in our world. And I'm sitting there thinking, it's so obvious there's something wrong here. The emperor is naked. I want to scream. Otherwise, as I said before, good, decent, kind, generous people have been numbed to the horrors of this particular event. And even those who freely acknowledge it as being a terrible thing will still fully embrace the crucifixion as necessary for whatever reason. You'll find very few Christians, although I have found some, who will actually say the crucifixion didn't need to happen. Ask Christians that and see what their response is. It's very interesting, and it's all over the board. But most will embrace the crucifixion as central to their faith. Luke, the host, not the writer of the gospel, suggested that the death of Jesus was a lesson to all of us on sacrificial living, as I mentioned earlier. And while this could be a very creative way of thinking about it, and it removes the need of the shed blood to cleanse us from sins, it still begs the question. The God of the universe could not come up with a way to teach us this very important lesson of sacrificial living. Couldn't come up with a better way than torturing a man to death? Do we not think more of God than that? You could do better. Everyone sitting here could come up with a better plan. Why do we not give God enough credit to come up with a better way to do that? If there is a God out there, let's hope it's not one that wanted Jesus to be tortured to death, who ignored Jesus' prayers. Jesus, who allegedly was sinless and perfect and beloved of God. Because if that God exists, it portends a very grim future for all of us and a very grim afterlife. So anyway, after thinking all these things, I did post to the Facebook group, and I wanted to read a little bit from that post. And I actually posted a couple, so this is the second one. I've been pondering in my last post, including a long session in the middle of the night last night. I remembered a phrase I heard in seminary. People should not be treated as a means to an end. People are not a means to an end. What does that mean? Well, first of all, I had to look it up. It was Immanuel Kant. And the gist is that human beings should not be treated as an end in themselves, and they should be treated as an end in themselves, not as a means to something else. In other words, humans are not tools. They're not keys. They're not things you use to gain something. If you treat people that way, you're using them as a means to an end, to gain something for yourself. Rather, people are themselves the end. Treat them that way as opposed to something to help you gain something else. Now, I'm not a philosopher. I never took a philosophy class, and I can't tell you much about Immanuel Kant. But I remembered that line from seminary. It left an impression all these years later. It brings me back to the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. And that's where we hear Jesus prays 3 times for God to take this burden from him. Now, this is where I'm speculating, and I'm way out there. You're not going to find a lot of people who probably think this way. But bear with me. Let your preconceptions go. And think if this might make sense. What if the whole point of the gospel story, at least in Mark, was a test by God to see who would refuse to accept Jesus as a means to an end? Whether it's remission of sins or as an example of how to live our lives. What if the whole point was to stand up for Jesus against God, seeing him as an abused son, and refusing to embrace the idea of murder of the innocent as part of God's plan? What if the story was not historical, since God would never require such an abuse to occur, but rather a divine fiction, a test of our common decency? Could we see past what we gain from the torture of Jesus from his death? Could we see past, oh, I get eternal life thanks to that death? Could we see past that to reject the whole notion as generally taught? When I was an evangelical, it was almost universally believed in my circles that we were saved by Jesus' death. By his blood, by his wounds we are healed. Maybe that's the wrong path of selfish focus that we're supposed to avoid. Maybe God wants us to wake up to our selfishness, our self-centered views, by showing us that we can be better and see that God would never ordain something so horrific, something like the murder of an innocent as a means to an end. Maybe this is what Christianity was meant to be, and maybe it's what it needs to become to make sense in a modern world. What if the Bible were a gigantic koan? A koan is like a riddle in Buddhism where it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but you think on it and think on it and think on it, and finally something snaps in your mind and you see things differently. What if this story was like that and people just never woke up and they took it at face value? What if the majority of Christians have utterly failed to solve it? What if the real measure of a Christian is the willingness to stand against evil even when it's God committing the evil? Now, since I've written this sermon, I actually encountered a book called Saying No to God. And it's a book that talks about examples in the Old Testament where characters actually argued with God. They negotiated with God. They tried to get God to do something differently. There's actually a tradition of this in the Bible, believe it or not. So what I'm doing isn't really all that bizarre right now. But just think about it. Instead of just constantly focused on this, how wonderful that Jesus shed his blood so I could go to heaven. What could be more selfish than that? I'm so glad that Jesus died so I could go to heaven. Maybe that's what God's trying to snap us out of. And it's not working real well. We had an interesting discussion in our Sunday school a little bit after I wrote this. Before I wrote this. And it ultimately led me to saying this to some people. Because there was one woman who was, and again, even though it's a very progressive, liberal Sunday school, one woman was still worried about hell a bit. Because, of course, she'd heard it her whole life. She was a little concerned that those of us who weren't believers in the class might go to hell. And I said, if anyone goes to hell, then all of you in heaven are screwed also. Because you're going to spend eternity waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because if God is like that, do you want to spend eternity with God? And we know God changes his mind from the Bible because he was sorry he made humanity and he wiped it out in Noah's flood. So maybe God's going to change his mind when you're in heaven. If God is like that, we're all in trouble. But I don't think God's like that. No one could possibly really be at peace in heaven, knowing that there are some people in this place called hell being tortured. So maybe God, if there is a God, wants each and every one to come to this realization. What if God wanted to see how many would accept an incredible injustice as long as they benefited from it? You know, a cosmic game of giving each person enough rope to hang themselves, and most have completely failed the test. Instead of standing against injustice, most churches embrace the biggest injustice of all. And they decorate their churches with things commemorating it, crosses and crucifixes, and they can't see the irony. And God sighs, rolls its eyes, and tries a different approach. Stay tuned. Again, this is sort of a mental exercise in one sense, wrestling with something that's horrific in another sense. You're not going to find too many people who view things this way, and you can say I'm full of hot air. That's fine, because I don't know if it's true or not. But when you have a story that horrific, I think humanity's reacted very badly to it. And instead of enshrining it and cherishing it, we can say no to God also. And then God will say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. All right. We have a bunch of new members, so I'll give you a second to turn to your hymnals, 414. And if you folks would stand as you're willing and able. Sing loudly, don't leave me hanging. And as we leave this friendly place, love give light to every face. May the kindness which we learn light our hearts till we return. Thank you very much. Go forth and do great things. For those staying, let's take about a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 5 till 11 for talk back. Hope to see everybody there.